Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special episode of the Animation Appreciation Podcast. It's our 50th episode. Woo! So, for my 50th episode, I wanted to do something special, a review that means something to me more than anything else. So, I chose Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. The reason I actually chose this book is a very personal one. My husband showed me this book when we first got together, and after reading it several times, I got hired by my current job. On another reread, I was telling this woman at work about it, and a few simple and basic questions from her later, she loudly says, "That's the one where the dragon gets high, right?" And I stared at her dumbfounded, for the dragon does indeed get high in this book. So she isn't wrong. Long story short, that's my best friend now, and between her and my husband, I quote this book frequently. So let's begin this book review. The story begins and ends with a silence of three parts, a short chapter that simply describes the settings of this book, and it does so by talking about the silences that fill it. Sounds boring, but honestly, it's how it is done. Rothfuss uses his words to pull you in so you feel as if you're there in this world with these people, and it all starts with a silence of three parts. I made a last minute change to this script. I'm actually going to go ahead and read you the first chapter as it's only about a page long. It's actually the prologue. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of three parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet made by things that were lacking. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn sign creaking in its hooks, and brushed the silence down the road like a trailing autumn leaves. If there'd been a crowd, even a handful of men inside the inn, they would have filled the silence with conversation and laughter, the clatter and clamor one expects from a drinking house during the dark hours of night. If there'd been music, but no, of course there was no music. In fact, there were none of these things, so the silence remained. Inside the Waystone, a pair of men huddled in one corner of the bar. They drank with quiet determination, avoiding serious discussions of troubling news. In doing this, they added a small, sullen silence to the larger hollow one. It made an alloy of sorts, a counterpoint. The third silence was not an easy thing to notice. If you listened for an hour, you might begin to feel it in the wood floor underfoot, and in the rough, splintering barrels behind the bar. It was in the weight of the black stone hearth that held the heat of a long dead fire. It was in the slow back and forth of a white linen cloth rubbing against the grain of a bar. And it was in the hands of the man who stood there, polishing a stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in the lamplight. The man had true red hair, red as flame. His eyes were dark and distant, and he moved with the subtle certainty that comes from knowing many things. The waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the three, wrapping the others inside of itself. It was deep and wide as autumn's ending. It was heavy as a great river's smooth stone. It was the patient, cut flower sound of a man who is waiting to die. I believe what we all just learned is that I should absolutely not do that for a living. That being said, besides my stumbling and fumbling words, that is actually the work of Patrick Rothfuss. That is just his way of describing silences. You should see the rest of the book. The actual story begins with the ending. It begins with a man named Coate, a bartender in the town of Nowar. He is tending to his inn when we find him, and throughout the story we learn he's actually a man of legend, Kavoth. He is known as Kavoth the Bloodless, Kavoth the King Killer, Kavoth the Arcane, but we are not yet told why he has all these names. Not yet. He is accompanied by a young man named Bast, who is his student. Student of what? We are not quite sure. The two tend the bar and live on top of it. All is peaceful until the chronicler shows up. With him comes word of spider demons called Scrael, who will kill a horse and nearly kill its owner before we even see the chronicler. The man they nearly killed is actually one of his patrons, the people that come to his bar. Kavoth lures the remaining Scrael to him using a piece of that he kept from the dead one, out into the woods where he tries to kill them. but is found by the chronicler. They survive, both chronicler and Kavoth, but only because of Kavoth. Chronicler is there to actually find Kavoth and write down his story, as in that is what he does. The book takes place over the first day of Kavoth telling his story. As he remembers who he is, we also start to learn who he was. As he's telling the story, we follow him from his childhood to his teen years, and you'd think there'd be more, but this innkeeper is surprisingly young. So all of his famous deeds are actually from his teen years. And we're going to learn more of them in books 2 and 3. Book 3 should end where it all began, at the Waystone Inn with the innkeeper Coat. In this first book, we only learn why he has one of those names, Kavoth the Bloodless. You will actually have to read or listen to find out, as I do spoiler free reviews. Honestly, though, if you're actually interested in a more detailed review without giving away too many of the details, you should actually go to Captured in Words on YouTube. They actually cover the two books better than I would, or as good as, if I weren't going for spoiler free here. The book draws you in and carries you with it. The way it feels to read this book or listen to it, if that's your preference, is similar to watching a Studio Ghibli film, in my opinion. The simple act of polishing the bottles in the book is just so calming, and you can just feel the moment perfectly. The book is well written and well thought out. There's actually a conversion chart for money and a calendar and more in the anniversary edition, which is the one I was reading from earlier. I poured over that for weeks. I can't express just what it feels like to read these words. I know I've tried, but it's so hard. Honestly, as a writer, he has one glaringly large flaw, and that is that the first book was published in 2007, the second in 2011. This is a trilogy. And as you will note, I didn't mention a release date for the third. Doors of Stone is book 3, and as of July of 2024, which is when I'm recording this, there is no word on when it will be published. So that's the only issue I have with this book. And in all honesty, I still read the first publication of Lightning Tree, and I actually read it when it was released outside of the Book of Rogues after it had been rewritten when it was bigger, and honestly, it was better. The story was the same, but the way it was told was 1,000 times better. That version of the third book would be worth waiting for. And that these two books we have is just worth reading on their own, even if we never do get that third book. On a side note, this book made me ache in a way I couldn't place when I was first reading it, and for several times after, and then it hit me. Kavoth plays a lute and mentions how it feels to not have an instrument when you know how to play and it's part of you. It is an addiction. My hands and face ached to play my trumpet again, and this book is half the reason I just had to have one again. It describes the moment of using a brand new instrument after so long without one. I've never seen it described so well, and it's written by a man who does not play any instrument. I will also be covering Wise Man's Fears in a future episode, but for now, that is my review of Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. And always remember, unless it's a spelling error, if it's in a book like this one, someone did it on purpose. As a quick side note, if you are confused by the dragon gets high line from the start, you'll just have to try the book and find out what part of the story that's from, but it is this book. Thank you again and have a wonderful night.